Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera. It's a very beautiful Sunday morning here in Japan. A little bit early on a Sunday morning. It's a little bit after 9 o'clock right now, and it's quite warm this morning. As you can see, I'm wearing a shirt. I'm not wearing a jacket, which is quite unusual. I've been wearing a jacket for the last, I guess, more than a month when I come out in the mornings, and it's nice to have a day where it's warm again. But Japan is like that. We can have really cool days, and an occasional nice and cool day in the summertime, and we can have warm days in the autumn or sometimes even the winter. So, nice time to be out. Yesterday was kind of chilly and very hazy out here, and then last night the rain came through and washed away the haze and brought some warm weather with it. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm out here early this morning because since it is a very nice day and it's the autumn season and the leaves are changing. As you can see here in the clip, everything is turning to a nice reds and golds and yellows and things like that. Because it's so nice, it's going to be quite crowded out here later today. I'm sitting kind of in a dining area next to the shopping center where they have some tables and chairs and things. And at the moment I'm the only person here because it's not open yet. But once it opens, it'll fill up quickly and people won't be able to find a spot to sit here. And the park will be the same way. It's quite interesting that things are so crowded, and it's kind of like that because the pandemic seems to have wound down here in Tokyo. We are not getting many cases and hardly any fatalities or anyone getting seriously sick, and things are more or less back to normal. All the shops, stores, restaurants, bars, clubs, schools, government offices, everything is running as it was before the pandemic. The only thing which is different is that people are wearing more masks than usual. But yeah, it doesn't say a whole lot because in certain seasons in Japan, a lot of people wear masks, and some people wear masks all year round. It's not so much that they are trying to protect themselves from cold or flu or stuff like that, but because the masks keep the dust out, they keep the pollen out, and also they help you, I guess, remain anonymous. So, and that's kind of a popular, I guess, sentiment here in Japan, is to remain anonymous. Which is kind of surprising because Japan is probably, Tokyo is one of the most anonymous cities in the world. There's so many people here. It's kind of difficult to remember, one from one day to the next. But anyway, things are more or less back to normal here, and hopefully things will begin getting back to normal in other places. So today's video, my first video, I plan to make a couple of videos today. The first video is about a rather interesting vintage Japanese camera from the 1950s, and this one is a Taron camera. Taron cameras were made in the 1950s mostly, and most Taron cameras were rangefinder cameras. And these were mainly targeted at ordinary consumers. They were not the most, I guess, complex or highest quality or most innovative cameras, but they were solidly made, easy to use, and reliable cameras, and quite popular with ordinary people rather than the more serious kind of photographers. But even so, they are built to a fairly high standard of quality, particularly when it comes to the optics. This particular camera is the VR model, which is one of the most popular models. And this was introduced around 1957, 1958, something like that. And as you can see, it's pretty much a basic, ordinary rangefinder camera with all the features and functions you would find on most other rangefinder cameras of the era. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the features, functions, how to use the Taron VR and such. So we'll go ahead and start at the top of the camera. And here we have the film rewind knob with a convenient fold-out lever. And it has a nice rotating handle to grab onto, which is something you don't find on all the cameras. And some of the more expensive cameras didn't have this feature. Here we have a little mark, a red arrow, and next to it is the word film. I don't know if you can read that, it's kind of small. And this marks the focal plane for the film. So when making precise adjustments or very precise focus, you would measure from your subject to the point of the red arrow to give you an exact distance to input into the lens. This isn't so necessary when shooting with a rangefinder camera, but it does come in handy if you're making focus adjustments, and you want to check to make sure that the focus scale on the lens is accurate to the actual distance between your film plane and your subject. Next to that, we have a shoe to mount a flash gun, and this is a cold shoe. If you're going to attach a flash gun, you'll need to have a PC sync cable, and that would attach to the socket here on the side of the lens. Next to that, we have the shutter release button, and this one accepts a standard cable release, and you can also use a screw-in self-timer if you happen to have one. Right here we have the frame counter window, and of course then we have the film winding and shutter charging lever, and around this we have a dial which you use to input the film speed of the film that you have loaded in the camera. Input is probably not really a good word because it doesn't matter what you set this at. It doesn't change anything within the camera. This is just to remind you what kind of film that you have loaded in the camera. If you were just shooting one kind of film, it doesn't really matter what it's set at, and yeah, it's just a reminder. Going to the back of the camera, quite simple here. The only thing we have back here is the viewfinder window, and it's a little bit larger than some of the viewfinder windows we find on other cameras, which makes it a little bit easier to shoot with this particular camera if you wear glasses. Moving on to the front, here on the top we have the viewfinder and rangefinder windows, and as you can see we have kind of large windows here for seeing through and composing and focusing. This makes the camera easier for those tasks. And in the middle here we have this kind of matte glass or gray colored glass, and behind this is where the projected frame lines sit. So the VR has projected frame lines, which are very convenient because you can see the frame lines around your subject, and you can also see around the outsides, and they don't actually block off the subject. So it's a really good feature, which not all cameras have. But on the VR, as it's not a very expensive camera, it doesn't have the parallax correction system that more expensive cameras have. But it does have guidelines on the frame lines, which you use when you are focusing at infinity or close focus. And like other rangefinder cameras, there's a large margin of error built into the frame lines. So even if your subject is a little bit outside of the frame lines when you're composing, more than likely it's going to be on the inside when you actually get the photograph. We'll go ahead and move to the lens, and this is where the important functions and such are. At the base of the lens we have the focusing ring, which has a handy focusing tab, and it has a good grip on it. It's knurled all the way around, hard to slip. And on the focusing ring we have the focusing scale, and these are measured in feet. That's kind of a good indicator of cameras which were designed mainly for the export market. Behind that, on the silver ring at the very bottom, is the depth of field scale, which shows you how much depth of field you have at any given aperture. If we move forward of that, we have this silver ring right here, which I'm turning, and this is where you set the aperture. We have a range of f2.8 to f16. Right here, as I mentioned earlier, we have the PC socket for mounting a flash. Over here we have the switch which selects between the X sync speed and M speed. And on the bottom we have the self-timer lever. And as I've mentioned before, if you have one of these old cameras, avoid using the self-timer whenever possible because it's always the weak link in these cameras. It's better if you need a self-timer just to use an accessory self-timer that plugs into the top or threads into the top. These were made by numerous companies. They're not expensive. They're much more reliable, and and the good thing about them is you can use them on pretty much all these old cameras. So if you're a collector of old cameras and don't want to use the self-timers, just use the accessory self-timer. It makes things a lot easier. Okay, moving on, we have another ring on the front, and this is the shutter speed ring. And the Taron VR, unlike some other cameras, has a full range of shutter speeds from bulb and 1 second all the way up to 1/500th of a second. The lens on the VR is a Nippon Kosoki Industries 45mm f2.8 and FC, so I guess fully coated or something coated lens. These are actually quite good lenses and very good performers. The VR was available with a couple of different lenses. This is a standard lens, the f2.8 lens. A faster lens was, I'm not sure if it was an f1.9 or an f2 lens. It gives you a little bit more speed, but there's not really any difference in the performance. Though a lot of people prefer the faster lenses because of the extra light gathering ability. It's kind of difficult to use these lenses at large apertures because it's more difficult to get a correct exposure because they let in so much light, and also the depth of field is very narrow, so it's more difficult to focus them. So lenses like this are going to give you probably a little bit better performance if you are not very steady or not using a tripod or cannot measure your exposure as accurately as some people can. And in my case, I generally do most of my shooting at around f8 or so because that's usually where you get the best performance out of most lenses. And as you can see, that happens to be the recommended aperture on this particular camera. The f8 is marked in red, but that's also sometimes a number or a guide number for using when you have a flash. So a particular situation, you would set the flash sync speed, and perhaps Taron made a specific flash for this camera which worked best at f8 or flash bulbs or whatever. So yeah, quite good. On the bottom of the camera we have a button which you push up to release the film winding mechanism, so you can rewind the film. And here we have a standard 1/4" tripod socket. Loading the film is quite easy. There's a catch located here just below the strap plug. Just push it upward and the door pops open. And loading the film is quite easy. There's a cutaway in the bottom here, as you can see, and that allows you to slide in the film cartridge so it catches up against the forks on the winding lever. Stretch your field leader across and thread it into the take-up spool and just turn it inward. And a good thing about this camera is when you are turning the take-up spool, it actually turns the winding cog here, which catches the film and turns it. When you're loading the film, always make sure to wind the film until it's wound across this cog, and make sure that the holes in the film are engaging the teeth. And then close the door, and the film counter automatically resets, and simply wind it up to number 1, and you're ready to shoot. So anyway, that's it for my video about the Taron VR. I'll be listing this camera for sale on my Etsy and eBay stores and my new online store, JapanVintageCamera.com. I'll post links to my stores in the description below the video. If you're interested in seeing more videos about vintage Japanese cameras or photography in Japan, please subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.